Beauty inside the house of injustice. That's our theme today. And I've got a brilliant poem for us that we'll get right to. But first of all, I want to welcome each of you to Dale Byron on Poetry, the weekly podcast where we use poetry in unusual ways to hitch it up to ecology, to politics, to philosophy, to all sorts of things. Um, Let me just mention that one of my operating principles in life and with my work with poetry and, of course, here on the podcast is that good, beautiful, pro social stories, and often those, as I've said many times before, can be poems, that those good, beautiful, pro social stories and poems can help us overcome stories and beliefs that tend to reinforce a more unjust, a more antisocial, a more, quite honestly, destructive moves within our particular culture. So we're trying to bring in the good, powerful stories to counteract those which are not helping us. Have you noticed? And so let's jump right into the poem by William Stafford. I've done this poem before, but it was so perfect for our theme, Beauty Inside the House of Injustice. Here's the poem, A Ritual to Read to Each Other by William Stafford. It goes like this. If you don't know the kind of person I am, if you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, then a pattern that others made may prevail in the world. And following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. You know, I want to dwell on this first stanza of the poem a little bit because I've used this poem, I don't thousands of times. I've read it thousands of times, used it in probably hundreds of workshops and talks. And those first lines, I think, are so clear, especially when, again, remember the theme is beauty inside the house of injustice. And often what happens in times where there's great injustice, which is happening, is that people are, it's like the poem says, that people are not dealing directly with each other, but they are being pushed against each other. They're being forced into a kind of animosity because they're listening to a story that's coming from the outside about the other. And it can be very destructive. So, again, the poet William Stafford says, if you don't know the kind of person I am, if you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, then a pattern that others made may prevail in the world. And following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. Some powerful imagery there, powerful metaphor. The poem goes on. For there is many a small betrayal in the mind, a shrug that lets the fragile sequence break, sending with shouts the horrible airs of childhood storming out to play through the broken dike. So, in other words, if we don't have direct experience of certain things in the world or of other people, we can have stories that come to us that can make us believe false things about the world and about other people. And that can be incredibly destructive and unjust. The poem goes on. And as elephants parade holding each elephant's tail, but if one wanders, the circus won't find the park. I call it cruel and maybe the root of all cruelty to know what occurs, but to not recognize the fact. Now, that's some interesting imagery that the poet Stafford is using there. But if you think about some very basic things that we know, so, for example, we know that a huge degree of wealth inequality in any country, in any nation, is very destabilizing. It's very destabilizing because those who have a massive amounts, like I sometimes say cartoonish wealth, are able to buy power. And so that the idea of democracy is diminished because the truth is, and we know this is not conjecture, this is not opinion, but if as economic power goes down, then democratic or political power also goes down. So you cannot have a society which is completely out of whack economically, where a small number of people control most of the wealth and still think that there's anything even close to a democracy, anything even close to political freedom. So as Stafford so well says, as elephants parade, holding each elephant's tail, but if one wanders, the circus won't find the park. I call it cruel, and maybe the root of all cruelty, to know what occurs, but to not recognize the fact. So that as we see this wealth inequality, and we are encouraged not to recognize the fact, we're encouraged to say, oh, that's fine. No problem. No problem. Um, the poem goes on, just two more brief stanzas. And so I appeal, says the protagonist in the poem, and so I appeal to a voice, to something shadowy, to a remote region in all who talk, though we could fool each other, though we could fool each other, we should consider lest the parade of our mutual life get lost in the dark. For it is important that awake people be awake. For it is important that awake people be awake, or a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. The signals we give, yes or no, or maybe, should be clear, should be clear. The darkness around us is deep. Now, one of the things I really believe is that you cannot force a poem into to do a certain thing. It doesn't work that way, because the best poems are a kind of language that's organizing itself almost. And in a way, though, once a poem, you can't force a poem to have a certain purpose. But if a poem sets into a certain area and makes us clear about a certain area, you can't stop it either. That's one of the brilliant things that I love about poetry. And so this poem, to me, is a kind of corrective. It's a kind of wonderful, good and beautiful and pro-social story that encourages us to know each other. It encourages us to have a direct experience of the earth, of the world, of the where we actually are, because that direct experience gives us all the information we need. So we're not getting information about other people or about the earth through secondhand stories that aren't helpful. You know, I might add that we are often, there's many roles that each of us play, but I was thinking to myself that each of us certainly plays a role as a family member and a friend. This is any, I'm using family in a very broad sense, and also friendship. So we have that role. We have the role of citizen. Of course, we have the role of artisan maker, or, whatever our profession is, whatever it is we do in the world, our work. I just call it artisan maker. And then we have this other role called consumer, which I don't like and I don't use very often. But if you notice, so many stories are coming at us in contemporary times that say, don't worry about your role as a family or friend or spouse or any of that family member thing. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about your role as citizen. Particularly, don't worry about that. And as an artisan maker, don't worry about that. Your freedom is to consume. That's your freedom, to consume. And to me, that is a very destructive story. Because yes, we buy things. Of course we do. We have to live. But our role as family and friend and spouse, and our role as citizen, our role as artisan maker, all incredibly important. All incredibly important. So this story, this poem story by William Stafford, I just love it. If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, then a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. For there is many a small betrayal in the mind, a shrug that lets the fragile sequence break. Sending with shouts, the horrible airs of childhood, storming out to play through the broken dike. And as elephants parade, holding each elephant's tail. But if one wanders, the circus won't find the park. I call it cruel. And maybe the root of all cruelty, to know what occurs, but to not recognize the fact. And so I appeal to a voice, to something shadowy, to a remote region in all who talk, though we could fool each other, we should consider lest the parade of our mutual life get lost in the dark. For it is important that awake people be awake, or a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. The signals we give, yes or no, or maybe, should be clear. The darkness around us is deep. Now, I've always imagined those last lines saying that it is so important for us to be awake to each other, for us to be awake to the world, to have direct experience of each other and of the world, not secondhand. That's what this poem is encouraging us to do. Because if we take someone else's story and we take it into ourselves, if we believe it, if we take it into ourselves, if we use it as a kind of cultural mythology to convince us, things like we're separate from nature, to convince us that other person is our enemy, to convince us that they are the problem. All of those kinds of secondhand stories, that then we are in trouble. The darkness around us can be deep unless we have a direct experience of each other and of this beautiful, amazing earth. Thank you so much for your listening ear. If you know of others who may appreciate this approach to poetry, and I recognize it's a little different, this sort of unconventional approach that loves poetry for its sheer beauty and magnificence, and also loves poetry because some of the best poems are like stories that can be a kind of artful correctiveness, to use that term, for some of the stories in our culture that really aren't helping us very much these days, that are actually destructive. So if you know others, then pass it along. And in the meantime, take good care of yourself. And as I always like to say, if you can, take good care of someone else. Thanks.